Welcome back to the Word Room. I'm so glad you're here. We are going through the entire Bible, chapter by chapter, breaking down the summary of the chapter, some key takeaways, and looking at what it tells us about God. Today, Genesis chapter 18. This is where Abraham has an encounter with God, and we see the first signs of destruction in Sodom and Gomorrah. You don't want to miss it. Let's go. All right, let's look at our summary of Genesis chapter 18. So in this chapter, Abraham has three visitors that come to him, and they aren't just any ordinary visitors. Two of them are angels, and the third one is Yahweh, or God himself. It's a pre-incarnate Christ, which is Jesus appearing before he was born as a human, and he's appearing in physical form. Now, we know this from other scriptures. You can actually go and look at my explanation from 2 chapters ago, where we talked about the angel of the Lord and explained how we know it is not God the Father or the Spirit, but rather Jesus. But we know it's a pre-incarnate Jesus, and the Lord, as well as 2 angels, come together and share a meal with Abraham. After sharing the meal with Abraham, they start talking, and God promises that Sarah would have a son the next year. Now, we know that he had promised this in Genesis chapter 17, which probably took place within a couple of months or a month before this event. So here we have this event again, and now he's coming and reaffirming, hey, you're going to have a son, which he had told him in chapter 17, and that they would name him Isaac. Sarah laughs within herself as she hears it, but then she tries to deny it, but God knew that she had laughed, and so he confirmed his promise. Now, the laughing was internal, it wasn't external. It says that she laughed within herself, but God knew her thoughts and knew what she was thinking and responded to her thoughts, and that he confirmed the promise to her. Why do you laugh? This is really going to happen. Here's the promise. Conversation then shifts to Sodom and Gomorrah, and Sodom was very evil. Sodom is where Lot lived, and God reveals his plans to destroy the city to Abraham. He's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and he lets Abraham in on that plan. Abraham then pleads with the Lord for the city. Now, this is significant that Abraham is pleading with the Lord for the city and not just Lot. He could have just argued for Lot to be saved, but instead he argues that the whole city would be spared. Not because Abraham delighted in their sin, but rather that he cared about people. And Abraham has a heart for the people there and begins to plead and intercede for them. So 5 key takeaways. Number 1, God appeared to Abraham shortly after the events of Genesis 17 to reaffirm his promise about Isaac. This is very important. It happens over and over. It's very short time between Genesis 17 and 18, and yet here's God showing up to reaffirm the covenant again. Why? Because it's so easy for us in our fallen human nature to doubt God. So God comes back and reaffirms his word over and over and over again. It's just part of the nature of who God is. Number 2, Abraham laughed in Genesis 17. Now Sarah laughs in chapter 18. So it's almost like both of them, it's showing the struggle of both of them to comprehend and even not necessarily believe, but how could this be possibly exist? How could this really happen? How could Sarah in her old age have a child? How is it possible? So they're both laughing, and this is important because to view something as crazy or impossible, or even questioning how this is possible or how it's going to happen, doesn't negate the promise. God doesn't look at your thoughts of something being impossible or crazy, or look at your thoughts of questioning how is it possible and say, well, I guess they're in doubt, so I'm going to not give them the promise. Nope. God is merciful. God is gracious. He brings about his promises, and he sticks to his word even when we struggle to comprehend it. Number 3, God shared his plan over the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah with Abraham because Abraham would need to understand what was happening to Sodom and Gomorrah to be a great leader in righteousness for the descendants that would come after him. It literally says in the chapter, God says, should we withhold our plans from Abraham? No, he's going to be a great nation. He's going to have many descendants, and he's going to need to lead them. So the idea is that God is sharing his plans so that Abraham can take that, have understanding of what's happening, know why Sodom and Gomorrah is getting judged, so A, he can lead and teach his people that come after him not to live like that, but B, so also he can explain the heart of God to them. God wants Abraham to lead well with the information that he shares with him. Number 4, we see that Sodom and Gomorrah's sin was great and very grave, causing an outcry to rise before the Lord. Out of all the places, there's sin all over the place, right? All the cities in Canaan, all the places but for some reason, this sin in Sodom and Gomorrah, we'll look at it in the next chapter, is so much greater than many of the other places, to the point that God has to respond. It says there's an outcry to rise before him. Now, we don't know if this is an outcry from people who've been wronged or harmed or victims from their sin, or if this is an outcry of just God's justice and his nature crying out to judge sin, because that is part of the nature of God. But God is going to judge sin. It's part of his nature. It's who he is. And their sin reached a level that judgment had to come. And number 5, God would spare Sodom and Gomorrah, even for the outcry that's coming before him. God would spare Sodom and Gomorrah with 10 righteous in the city. This actually starts a negotiation. Abraham's like, will you spare the city for 50? Well, yes, I would. Oh, well, what about, 5 less than that? It's just 5 less. 45? Would you spare the city for 45? Yes, what about 30? And then he starts jumping down by 10s. What about 20? What about 10? Ultimately, he gets down to 10 people, and God says, yes, I would even spare the city for 10 righteous. Very interesting that he would spare the city for 10 righteous. There wasn't 10 righteous in the city, and God knew that. But it's not like he didn't know how many were righteous in the city. But God is having this conversation with Abraham because he's teaching Abraham. He's drawing out of Abraham a heart of intercession, which is very important. So 5 things this tells about God. Number 1, God does not judge the righteous with the wicked. That he would spare the righteous. He would spare the entire city for a certain number of righteous. But we see in the next chapter, which we'll get to tomorrow, God will even spare the wicked city. Even when he judges the wicked city, God will even spare the righteous. He will pull them out to spare the righteous, because he will not judge the righteous along with the wicked. That's very important. Number 2, he knows our inward thoughts. In this chapter, Sarah laughs within herself, and God knows that she laughed and responds to her laughter, even though it was within her own mind. God knows your inward thoughts, and this is powerful about God. You don't have to hide anything from God, because you can't. You can be completely open and vulnerable before God, because he knows your inward thoughts. He knows what you're really feeling. He knows it better than you. So you can be vulnerable with God. Very important. Number 3, he wants us to use the knowledge he gives. God gives Abraham knowledge about what's going to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah, but he does it for the purpose of Abraham taking that knowledge and using it to lead and to teach the others who would come after him. Very important thing about God is that God, while he wants us to have knowledge, he doesn't want us to just gain knowledge, and he doesn't want to just reveal things to us so we can be puffed up and arrogant and say, look what God showed me. He wants us to use the information he gives us, the knowledge he gives us, the wisdom he gives us. God speaks to us, and then he expects us to take what he said and do something with it. Which begs the question, what has God spoken to you that you haven't done anything with? Keep that in mind as you read this chapter. Number 4, we see that God is a judge. This is important because we know that if he's not going to judge the righteous with the wicked, that does mean he is going to judge the wicked. And that's very important because he is a judge. That's part of his nature. He is a righteous judge and he's a just judge, but he will release judgment. And number 5, he wants us to intercede. God knew Abraham, he knew how many righteous people, when they were interceding and going back and forth, God knew how many righteous people were in Sodom. He could have just stopped them right at the beginning and said, but there's not 50 people. There's not 10 people. There's only this number of people. God could have said that to Abraham, but he didn't. He engaged with him because he was pulling out of Abraham a heart of intercession for people. Very important that God wants us to intercede. 5 things we learned about God. Go study this chapter, dig a little deeper, comment down below what you got out of this chapter, and hit the like button, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.